We all know when something just ain't right, and
Yeah.
this very much looks like it ain't right. Welcome to SecOps Weekly. It's great to see you guys again. I know you haven't seen me for a month, but you got to see Tony last week, so I'll reintroduce myself first. Hi, I'm Stef. I am a senior intelligence analyst at Zscaler. Tony, say hi to everybody who wasn't here last week.
Hi, I'm Tony Lambert. I am a senior malware analyst at Zscaler.
And we have an Intel team takeover, which is always fun. And Tony and I always have a good time when we get to chat about thready threats. So this is going to be great. Let's go ahead and dig into it. So if I'm here, that means y'all know we're talking about monthly insights for the previous month. And that's one of the themes that we're going to talk about today, but not the only thing we're going to talk about today. Any vibes, anything you want to throw out before we start talking about our top 10, Tony?
Trying to think. So there's a couple of themes of like a lot of kind of Rube Goldberg machine kind of malware with Castle things, and then with macOS stuff, a little bit of kind of evolution, a little bit of, learning and experimenting as folks have gone along. So that'll be fun to look at.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's talk about the things. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run through our top 10 and give y'all a preview for the insight that's going to come out on Thursday. Number one for the third month in a row is ClearFake. ClearFake has continued to dominate the rankings, continues to use malicious copy and paste slash click fix, fake captcha, all the different fixes. We'll talk about a new fix today. Kongtuki reappears back in number two, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide too, just to give some context. But it's been a while since we've seen Kongtuki in the top 10, and especially at the level that it's at. We've got Scarlet Goldfinch also back up in the rankings and Screen Connect as well. Our newcomer is CastleLoader, so that's going to be one of the things that we kind of feature and talk about today. And then for the rest of the list, it's a bunch of frequent flyers. We've got Atomic and MaxSync Stealer. We've got ACR Stealer and Vidar, which are popular malicious copy and paste payloads right now. And Net Support Manager, which is actually connected to CastleLoader, which is interesting. So what do you think? What do you think about this mix of newcomers, kind of returns, familiar faces?
I remember talking about like the familiar faces, the returns. I remember going back like five years ago, something like that, where people would ask about macOS malware stuff, and some of it was like kind of the ad fraud things or pups or like Schlayer period
Actually,
stuff like
yeah.
that. But there weren't like consistent things on macOS that would show up with a high volume every month.
Hmm.
And it's really kind of a different, statement to difference in times that like Mac stuff is having something every month now, like where like engineers and developers, things like roles like that are using Macs more. So that's where the keys are now.
When did that change? I'm gonna throw Chris an audible and ask him to go look at our top 10 over time and see if he can throw in the chat when it was that like MaxSync and Poseidon and Atomic really started coming into our top 10 and being frequent flyers. Because you're right, that has not always been the case. So we'll give
Absolutely.
him we'll give him a couple minutes to go do that. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how that has changed. Um, Not interesting in a good way, interesting in a clinical way.
Yeah.
The way clinicians say it, like,
It's one of those that you don't want to hear of like, ooh, that's weird.
hmm. So just kind of general impressions again. We've already talked about some of this a little bit, but ClearFake's third consecutive month at number one. And I don't think that's looking to change next month either. We'll see. Kong Tuki hasn't been in the top five or even in the top three since November of last year. So this is a big upswing. We have seen it pretty consistently, but not at the level we're seeing it at this month. This is the first big wave of it that we have seen since November. Other folks have seen it consistently, but as you all know, there's a lot of variables to how things actually end up in our top 10 specifically. But yeah, we saw a huge increase in the number of Kongtuki threats that we were publishing last month. And let's see, Chris is awesome and found the thing. So Max Sync showed up in the top 10 last December and last September. So really, it feels like it's been much longer. I was
Yeah,
thinking maybe way last year.
it's followed that paste and run trend because that's where everybody and their brother is gone.
They didn't start doing paste and run though, like malicious copy and paste. Within that took longer because
It
of the
did.
homebrew style campaigns were one of the later around that time.
Yeah.
Actually, you're right. You're right. It did come into the top 10 when they started doing that paste and run initial execution technique.
Yeah, they've been doing this cat and mouse game with Apple where something changes and they decide to adapt, and that's how they got into the paste and run game.
hmm And Dash point out Sagolish was top 10 like a year before that. Yeah. And Sagolish is interesting too. We have not seen, as y'all have noticed, it has not been in the top 10. We've been following it in OSINT as well, and that seems to have dropped off, which we've actually talked about off and on the team, kind of looking into it. Can't offer any additional insights on that. But yeah, it's interesting how those things change over time, which is why we track it and like to come talk about it. Scarlet Goldfinch in the top three. Again, we haven't seen it at that level since earlier this year, which is interesting. And then we did see Kali 365, which I'll remember we talked about that last month. That fell off the top 10, but we're still seeing device code phishing. So that's another thing with our top 10. Keep in mind, it's our top 10. So sometimes if we see a lot of threat volume, we'll also be seeing lots of other things that just don't quite make the cut for the top 10. But yeah, we're definitely still seeing device code phishing activity. All right. Well, with that, do you want to go ahead and talk about CastleLoader?
Sure.
Let's talk about CastleLoader. Um, CastleLoader's interesting. So I remember I was here last month. We were talking about malicious copy and paste. I talked about some of the changes that we had been seeing, and somebody in the chat, and I wish I could remember who, was like, "Oh, we've also been seeing it with a lot of finger commands." And I was like, "Yeah, we've seen that too, but we were just starting to kind of pull together. We've been tracking it internally for a while and deciding how we wanted to track it for our top 10 purposes. So we're tracking that cluster as CastleLoader. So we have been seeing it for a while, but it is making its debut in the top 10 this month at number 5. And it's being used to deliver different payloads. I mentioned that Net Support Manager was on the top 10 this month in one of the ties for 7th. And this is why. It's because it's being delivered as a CastleLoader payload, which is interesting. And Tony, I remember that when we were initially starting to look at that, um, you and some of the other folks in our inter team were really looking at that, and we'll get to it. The Python bring your own installer loader, but I'm getting my head of myself ahead of myself a little bit. Um, but yeah, more click fix. Hey,
Uh,
more click fix.
it turns out it's what works. Like, going back 2 years, we'd see a bunch of update.js files getting downloaded by people, and it turns out that it's more effective to just tell someone to paste.
It's wild. It's the new macros. It's
Yeah.
just going to be like this until
Yes.
it's not like this anymore. Whenever that is, I don't know when that's going to be. Um, So yeah, it's been delivered with different paste and run malicious copy and paste campaigns. Huntress called out a campaign called Background Fix, which is specifically using a lure that is to there are these fake background removal sites, which is interesting. Um, and that's the lure or one of the lures that we're seeing to trick victims into copying and running these malicious clipboard commands. We see lots of PDF app kinds of lures. I had not heard of using background removal sites as a lure before, so that's interesting.
I could kind of see it because I know a lot of people get bored of like static wallpaper stuff and want some of the like the like rotating backgrounds or like live background sort of stuff. So I could see that being a good lure, like kind of like we've always seen of like people downloading wallpaper changers and things like that.
You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen that. And like screensaver uh lures were popular for a while, like downloading
Yeah,
screensavers,
the
things like
.scr
that.
files.
Yeah. Let's see, Dash, fake cleaners and optimizers. Yep, tried and true for low tech. And you're right, backgrounds of wallpapers. Yep, was the era before that. It's vintage.
Yep.
Vintage, just like all the music that we grew up enjoying. So yeah, let's talk about the infection chain. We touched on it here, and I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide because we've got an awesome
Perfect.
diagram that got put together for how this works. Um, so let's discuss. So we've got the fake background removal, and we saw some of that, but we also saw campaigns that were typo squatting as LinkedIn and Indeed pages to act as the lure for the original kind of like come in, do the fake CAPTCHA. And this is fake CAPTCHA too. The ones we saw were those typo squatted LinkedIn and Indeed pages with fake CAPTCHA attached to that, which was then the paste and run. Using finger.exe with some interesting obfuscation. Lots of carrots. I
Yeah.
don't know why, all the carrots.
The fun part, so it's kind of a mixture. So a couple of fun things with finger.exe being used in this way. We're all fairly used to using some intrusion detection system, something like that, that's looking at HTTP traffic. Finger isn't HTTP traffic, it's another network service behind the scenes. So it doesn't immensely hide things, but it can like just hide things from some like casual observation. If your inspection systems aren't looking at finger traffic, that's something that might be missed. The
Hmm.
carrot stuff gets into some fun worlds because with the carrot obfuscation, you can kind of break some command line obfuscation or some command line detection analytics, but not affect the actual effect of the commands. So
Hmm.
like with command with PowerShell, some of those, like you start inputting the carrot items, in theory, it doesn't break the actual command, but whenever you're monitoring an EDR, if you have like a really strict rule for that EDR rule, that carrot will kind of throw that off just a little bit.
Hmm. Hmm. I remember when we were seeing a lot of TA 570 and TA 577, they really like to use carrots
Similar.
for obfuscation as well in their initial execution scripts. Um, so it's not new, but it's pretty pronounced, especially with these finger.exe commands. And we'll have
Yep.
some examples of the command lines and what those look like in our Insight when it comes out on Thursday as well. So if you're curious about that, there has been some open source reporting. Chris already shared the background fix article from Huntress. But if you're interested in seeing some more examples, we'll have those available for you on our blog on Thursday. Let's talk about the bring your own installer and the kind of some of the capabilities of CastleLoader. So I remember when we first started seeing a lot of this, and we were talking a lot about the Python piece of this. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the Python stuff can be kind of fun because uh, adversaries to an extent have gotten kind of wise as to some of the telemetry that can be generated by tools on Windows and different systems. So like let's say that adversary decides they want to do PowerShell, something like that. PowerShell gets logged into event log a lot of times. If you have the proper Windows event logging setup, you know, the PowerShell operational logging will flag weird things there. In addition, EDR platforms have like AMSI providers, AMSI providers where they can go and monitor stuff like that.
Mhm.
Most of the EDR providers probably don't look at like Python script content in the same way that they would do PowerShell content. So some of them definitely do. So I know some vendors do have something that monitors in that sense, but adversaries have figured out if I bring a Python interpreter, if I bring a Node interpreter, Deno, or whatever else, I can typically evade just a little bit long enough to get my malware on the system. And that's kind of what they did here
Mhm.
with all the CastleLoader stuff. The first Python stage, once they have deployed that Python interpreter there, they will run Python with a command line that downloads a payload from a remote URL and then does a kind of a it's the equivalent of a curl to a bash in Python language,
Hmm.
like just a download directly into the interpreter and running it. And because they do it that way, files don't touch disk with malicious content. The only stuff that touches disk is just the legitimate Python interpreter.
Right.
So they start processing all of that stuff into memory, and that's where all the subsequent steps start coming in. And
Hmm.
it looks really complicated in EDR sometimes because all of the telemetry from like five different stages is smushed together.
It is. It is smushed together, and it's smushed together with with this Python interpreter.
Yeah.
So at first glance, if nothing else, it causes, like it did with us, a brief moment of like, oh, but Python, but this is a Python interpreter. We still catch it, we still see it, but it's not, it's unusual. It's unusual.
I've I've had to start kind of mentally in my mind go like, all right, this chunk of bytes is Python script, this chunk of bytes is CastleLoader, and then kind of categorize it in bytes from there.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So it's a I always hate saying something is well constructed because it sounds like I'm giving the bad guys props. But this has got a lot of capabilities that are very helpful for adversaries. So it does have things like anti-analysis checks and VM detection. It's got the shell code is like encoded at multiple layers as it starts executing and pulling down these payloads. It's got some other things that will, if it has not been detected up to that point, that will kind of set off major alarm bells, particularly the C2 communication. We've talked a lot in the past about um, network communications that don't have visible command lines. So something is making these really external netcons from any unexpected program bad. But having them doing that without a command line, especially if it's something like run DLL32, very suspicious. And we do see that with CastleLoader as well. And yeah, so it's a very effective loader. It's able to load and execute different payloads. It can do screenshot capture. It wouldn't surprise me if we continue to see this at a fairly high volume, especially since it's using malicious copy and paste like everybody else so successfully. Um, so, any final thoughts about CastleLoader, about sort of these styles of campaigns before we move on to some more Mac malware conversations?
I like the point of like we're going to continue to see quite a bit of CastleLoader because something that we've kind of noticed over time is CastleLoader kind of showing up in a diverse set of activity where sometimes CastleRat will be deployed afterwards, and sometimes this other malware will be deployed. And it seems like that because it has that stuff that has that kind of wide diversity of being included with multiple malware families definitely has like it definitely keeps its place over time on top 10.
Makes me think of Hijack Loader in
Yes.
that sense. Like it gets adopted by a lot of folks. It's very, you can use it in a lot of different, like you said, different campaigns, different payloads. And so it would not surprise me at all if we started seeing this at the same kind of volume that we did Hijack Loader for a while. It's the latest shiny new thing, and adversaries love the latest shiny new thing. Speaking of the latest shiny new thing, let's talk about some changes to Mac malware obfuscation. I'm really excited to hear about this because you and I have not had a chance to chat about it yet. So I get to learn along with the rest of y'all about kind of what's going on and what's been happening in the past 30 days.
Absolutely. So for folks that aren't as familiar with the macOS kind of Stealer ecosystem behind the scenes, so let's imagine that you have Stealers going on Windows that are using PowerShell, something like that. So the PowerShell equivalent over on macOS is AppleScript. It's not a one-to-one, but it's close enough for us to make a good analog. Um, and for the longest time, Steelers have kind of gotten away with being able to live in AppleScript and be able to execute, pretty clear text commands to the point where, we could write detection analytics looking for OSA script processes with the word cookies in the command line. I kid you not. It has been fairly successful just doing stuff like that. Um, and then as things went on over time, Apple said, all right, we're not going to take it anymore. Let's fight back. So if you're used to the Windows ecosystem, Windows has Windows Defender, Mac OS has XProtect.
Hmm.
So XProtect runs on YARA rules, YARA signatures that are provided by Apple. And then as time progresses, Apple writes more and more YARA signatures to put into XProtect. And somewhere the last couple of months, last few months, Apple said, all right, we're going to do all of these signatures in YARA for AppleScript things. And they figured out how they could kind of scan AppleScript things prior to running.
I remember we did talk about this when this first started
Yeah.
happening a couple of months ago. Yeah, I remember talking about this with you then.
Yeah, it was they figured out some way to like kind of like with AMSI stuff on Windows, hey,
Hmm.
let's take a second pause and scan that content, see what we can get.
Okay.
And in that same release, they had a bunch of YARA rules for Atomic Stealer, for Maxing Stealer, Fexia, different ones like that,
Hmm.
because um, all of them were using AppleScript. And I believe to Dash's effect in Chad, what he was saying was there are quite a bit of shared content, shared code between the Steelers, where like, Odyssey or Poseidon Stealer would do one thing, and Atomic says, "Hey, that's kind of cool. Let's do that too," and just let's borrow that code. And there's some kind of debate back and forth as to whether, some of them might be related, take code from one another, all the good stuff like that. So the next natural evolution, just like with Windows, PowerShell, different stuff like that, people said, I'm tired of getting detected. Let's include some obfuscation. Let's make it harder to read. And so they went down the line of including like number-based, decimal-based obfuscation, things like that. If you do like CyberChef recipes, like the CyberChef recipe, like from decimal is really helpful for some of that obfuscation.
Hmm.
The same obfuscation patterns happen on AppleScript. So you can kind of see back in April, we have kind of a more clear text thing on bottom. You can see artifacts in there of some of the files that they're interested in, some of the
Hmm.
things that the AppleScript is doing. Then up on top, in the last 30 days, this particular example was Atomic Stealer, and you can kind of see like there's a lot of number-based obfuscation in there that gets converted into character codes later to do the execution.
Hmm.
The good thing about all of this is it's all a trade-off.
Okay.
It's really awesome that you can evade your YARA rules for XProtect, but guess what? You still look shady to EDR.
Yeah, that's very shady.
So it turns out you can write your own detection analytics just for obfuscated AppleScript, and you don't just catch Atomic Stealer, you could catch other things that are, using the obfuscation as well. So everything is a trade-off in this world, and you just have to figure out like which evil you want to go with.
So is this what kind of obfuscation is it? I know that there was a subtraction-based obfuscation that showed up earlier this year when they were starting to try and like experiment with some of these
Yep.
obfuscation styles. What kind of obfuscation is this?
So it comes down to ASCII character code obfuscation. So like
Okay.
so I don't know the ASCII number codes off the top of my head. My
That's
my
all right. I
my
don't think that's not required of you, so
my foo is not that strong
I
here,
don't think
but
anybody
the
is.
but like the number 75 might correspond to the letter S,
Oh yeah, okay.
something like that.
All
And
right.
so the addition and subtraction stuff, we're all just offsetting what is the actual character code supposed to be.
Okay.
So like if I add in additional math in there, your tools like CyberChef and things like that that can just do your from decimal will stutter at that subtraction or the addition stuff and say, you have to try a little bit harder.
Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting. And it's interesting how I don't want to say that like how to put this. There has been such a high volume of obfuscated Windows script execution over the years
Mhm.
that you have to do a lot of really intricate, elaborate, tricky kinds of obfuscation to try and sneak around defenses. I feel like with Mac malware, this is newer, it's
Yes.
fresher, and so I get the sense that we're gonna see a similar kind of pattern of escalation, kind of like you're talking about. Like before, we could just execute things in AppleScript and nobody was looking. Well, now they're looking. Now there are YARA rules. So now we're going to start obfuscating. And I
Hmm.
imagine that a similar escalation style is going to happen with Mac OS script execution as happened with Windows script execution.
Yep, it's very similar thing. Like from there's almost like different tiers of like your tier zero is just no obfuscation at all. Tier one is where exploring basic encodings, your decimal ASCII code stuff, your base 64 encoding, things like those. Then we start getting from, tier two above is going to be all right, we're trying to do a little bit of encryption or we're trying to do XOR patterns and things like that. So the next step for this, once people get wise enough, is they're going to probably start doing XOR patterns. They're probably going to start exploring a little bit of encryption stuff. Uh, AppleScript has the power of some like JavaScript things under the hood.
No,
So it would
no.
not surprise me if you could do some JavaScript magic to encrypt some
Oh,
things.
I don't like that.
Yeah, but the good news is that's again looks shady.
It does. It does. That's true. We all know when something just ain't right, and
Yeah.
this very much looks like it ain't right. It'll be interesting, and it's been interesting seeing how the Mac malware trends have developed over time and how similarly they have followed each other. So I'll be intrigued to see kind of how this continues to develop.
Mhm.
And I know that, oh, we have a question. Since macOS Red Team tooling is thinner than Windows, um, what should I be building myself versus relying on existing frameworks? Oh, we have a
Ooh.
bunch of questions all of a
All
sudden.
right, we're going
Okay.
to have fun.
All right. So let's start with Harsha's first. What do
All
you
right.
think? Building myself versus relying on existing frameworks.
The starting point is Mythic. The
Mm,
starting point is the Mythic Red Team framework tool because Mythic will have agents in nearly any language that you want to explore in Go, in um, I think the original Mythic agent was AppFell. It was based in JavaScript, AppleScript-y things. And I would say whatever you can't do with Mythic, start exploring from there.
okay.
That would be the fun thing with that because Mythic has quite a bit of functionality built in. And if you really want to learn about red team tooling and you really want to learn about building stuff, whatever isn't in there gives you opportunity to build it. And then if you want to learn how to make it into the agent, there's agents in multiple different languages. So whatever language you're interested in, you can probably build it in that too.
Nice. That's very nice. Awesome. And then we have another question. What is the equivalent of .NET classes abuse in AppleScript? That's a
.NET
fun
class
question.
reviews. All right. So the under the hood in AppleScript, there's the open, I think it's the open scripting architecture, OSA stuff, where
Hmm.
that's where OSA script comes from.
Right?
So there are ways that you can kind of bridge into, I don't know if it's Objective-C or different stuff. You can use JavaScript together with AppleScript things. So like if you're familiar with AppFell and Mythic, there's a JavaScript for automation language that is somewhat supported on a rocky basis.
Hmm.
Some versions are really awesome, some aren't.
Okay.
Um, so like you can kind of abuse some of the PowerShell stuff behind the scenes there, and there are other like open scripting OSA structures that you can manipulate in AppleScript. I just don't necessarily know offhand what those would be.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. That's fair. All right, we're going to continue and we might go over a couple of minutes if y'all need to drop, that's fine. But Harsh's next question is also interesting. So we're going to keep on with the Tony AMA, Max Steeler AMA. So the question is, how do attackers abuse things like launch agents, and legitimate macOS mechanisms, to blend the malicious execution into normal looking activity?
Absolutely. So a good example, I wish I had a screenshot of Fexia
I
here
know I was going to ask you about Fexia when I was
because
like,
there is one threat, Fexia Stealer on macOS that has been actually doing something like this fairly recently, where uh, with launch agents and launch daemons, both of these are persistent structures. If you're familiar with the Windows side, you may be familiar with Windows Registry auto run keys or startup menus on the startup folder or startup menus on your start menu. Uh, launch agents and launch daemons are essentially similar, except they're just files on disk.
Okay.
They're just like plist files, which are like property files on disk. Launch daemons have to be for root. They have to be for administrators. Launch agents can be for root administrators, or they can be for individual users, because why not? Just like with auto run keys, you can do some that are users, some that are admins. And so, what adversaries will do in these cases with Fexia, they will have a launch agent that specifies that on launch, when the user logs in, a bash process or a Z shell process needs to run with these command line flags.
Hmm.
And then those command line flags will then download and execute something in AppleScript to run Fexia.
Okay.
Um, so the the hardest part about this is, honest to goodness, just hunting launch agents and launch daemons.
Hmm.
That's something that EDR isn't always the best at, but if you have some like good YARA hunting rules for looking for launch agents with Bash and Z shell and suspicious process names in them, you can get some fairly good mileage out of that.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank
Oh,
you,
no
Tony. And thank
problem.
you for all of the wonderful questions, y'all. Much appreciated. It has been an absolute pleasure to get to come and talk with y'all again this month. Thank you for joining us, Tony. Thank you for coming and jamming
Always
with me
have to.
today. Always delightful. Next week, we're going to talk about, not we, Tony and I, but at SecOps Weekly, talking about the challenge of tracking RMM abuse. So please join us next week, and we'll look forward to talking with y'all soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for joining in.